So I'm excited today. The title that I had wanted for this was You Got the Bot, Now What? Because the number of robotic platforms that are being developed, and we need them all, but it's become a crazy landscape. So I've got a great panel here that's going to give their unedited insights on everything, which is why I feel fortunate to help facilitate this. So let's start down the line here. Fernando Pacheco is an investment director at Endeavour Vision, a growth stage medtech venture-based firm in Switzerland and the US. He's an engineer by training, and he spent time in medtech and R&D and strategy consulting before joining venture. So that means you actually know what you're talking about. He leads Endeavor's work in robotics, having co-led their investment in virtual incision last year, where he's currently a board observer. Next up, if you follow robotics, you'll know who he is. So Jeff Alvarez, also known to have the best hair in medtech. Jeff is the chief strategy officer at Moon Surgical. He led product at Auris. In fact, he was hire number 1 at Auris. Fred actually coaxed him to come over, where he defined their endoluminal robotics platform, Hansen Medical, their vascular robotics platform, and dozens of other medical devices. Jeff believes the future of healthcare is in efficiency, where the effective therapy can be delivered in less time with less training and fewer resources. And Edvardas Satkauskas has spent 15 years as an engineer and an entrepreneur creating medical devices from lab to market. Currently, he's the co-founder and CEO of a company which develops robotics, Sentante, for endovascular interventions. And all the way on the end there is Todd Usen. So this is off script. So Todd is proof that previously sitting CEOs in large strategic med device companies can walk into a startup and crush it. Okay, so as a headhunter for 30 years, whenever I used to present presidents and CEOs or executives, and you send them to VCs, VCs go, nah, not going to be able to do it without the resources. So Todd is president and CEO at Activ Surgical, where he's overseeing the FDA clearance of its Activ site technology, and he's led 4 series fundraising rounds for over $86 million. Previously president of Medical Systems Group at Olympus, as well as president of orthopedics at Smith & Nephew. So gentlemen, thanks for joining us today. So let's first start out. Todd, I'll toss it to you. What's your definition of a med tech robot these days?
A med tech robot is intuitive in everybody else. And I don't mean it with disrespect to everybody else, because we're rooting for everybody's robot to be good. But it's the landscape has been one company that's been out there and is paving the way for others, and we're excited to watch the others join. But I also think a med tech robot is originally it's hardware. You said bot, now what? It's this big robot, but what are you getting from the robot other than unbelievable degrees of freedom and arms and all these cool things that you can do? But I think it's coming to the point that it's what's going to be added that's going to make a difference. But that's the way I think of robotics right now.
Edvardas?
So that's a big name robot. Everybody likes it. Everybody uses it. Initially, probably most of robots started off as of just being a good manipulators or something. But as you add some features, some more autonomy, you can do more things and more degrees of freedom, as Todd just mentioned. Then you are getting to close to a name robot, which you could usually, use by definition. So I think a lot of robots, those 200 in development you mentioned, are moving closely to that direction, getting more autonomy and actually becoming robots instead of being assistants in this way.
Jeff?
Yeah, I think of robots as meeting 3 criteria. The first is they have to be able to sense and understand the environment around them. Ambient environment or forces or things that are being acted upon it. And then they need to be able to compute, so to take that information, digest it, understand it, and draw conclusions from it. And the third is to then be able to act so that they can react and influence the world around them. And I think under those 3 principles, the last thing that's important for a robot is that it helps us and take some burden off of humans in some way. That's how I think about a robot.
So I want to stay on that because Fernando, I'll get to you. Take the burden off humans. However, most of the robotic platforms I look at add a cognitive load that the surgeon has never had to deal with before. So we'll revisit that. Fernando, your definition of robot.
I mean, I was going to build on that. It's just, I think it's the kind of ultimate enabling technology, right? In terms of enabling a broader variety of physicians, different trainings, et cetera, to do things that only, the top of the top could do. And something that hasn't really happened, I think, at least in soft tissue surgery up until now. It's getting there on the orthopedic side. I'm not quite sure if it's there yet, but that's how I see it. And yeah.
So let's talk about soft tissue robots. Right now, I mentioned in my last panel that there are over 220 robotic platforms being developed right now in R&D. And 100 of them, I believe, are soft tissue, meaning thoracic and abdominal in nature. And to date, what do we've got? We've got 2 have been cleared in the US, Ascensus and Intuitive, and we've got CMR here. And if I'm missing any, please let me know. Why is it so much harder, Jeff, I'll start with you, to develop a soft tissue robot than it is an orthopedic robot?
It's a great question, and it's a crunchy one. The soft tissue is a very dynamic procedure. It's very fluid. You get in, you get into the abdomen, and everything's there, and it can be moved around, and you have to lift up tissue, interact with things, and because of that, it requires very different performance criteria than traditional robotics, right? A lot of robots are serial chain manipulators that have been designed to precisely repeat steps over and over and over, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of times. And that's because it all comes from manufacturing. Those don't translate well into soft tissue surgery. And, in getting a fast pathway to market, a lot of companies have looked at how do we just leverage these manufacturing types of arms to do these procedures. That creates a lot of unique technical hurdles. And so then you say, well, maybe we need to develop these arms on our own. That is an incredible technical hurdle as well. And so the development burden to bring a commercial robot to the market is substantial, and there's a lot of things that can go wrong along the way.
Edvardas, you're developing a platform right now.
Yeah, for endovascular. And I agree with Jeffrey's comment that, well, in general, when do you need robots? So either it's a hazardous environment that you want to take human out of it, or is it repetitive tasks that robot can do over and over, or is it a task that human struggles to do and the robot can do it better, more precise, faster, or whatever. So yeah, we are developing the platform which actually addresses all of those things. We are taking surgeon out of X-ray. We are doing some parts of procedure automatic, which are routine and easy. And we are giving the surgeon ways to perform operation, which he previously had none. So basically, he can use the features of the robot that makes the procedure easier for him. And basically, coming back to your previous title, you get robot, now what? From a surgeon's perspective, life is good then. You have really, really a nice system which helps you in many different ways and aspects. And coming back to soft tissue, I think that is the challenge, because there you don't have that many repetitive tasks. You kind of away from hazardous environment. But the things you need to do there requires really special skill and experience, and it's hard to make a good robot for that.
Mm-hmm. Todd, you and I were at SRS down in Vic Patel puts on down in Orlando, and in front of you were there too. And one of the things that kept on coming out was the robot doesn't matter that much anymore. Remember that narrative? Take us through some of that narrative. Share with the audience here, and with your background in visualization, why that seems to have come to the forefront in the robotics world.
Yeah, it was very interesting, and I come from still our foundational patent, our first patent in our company. Our founder completed the world's first fully autonomous robotic surgery. So we have that, and we're not going to let that go. But the thought process when we're sitting there is the question, first there was an investor panel and surgeons and investors. And no one mentioned the word robot other than the companies that it's time for them to catch up, that they should. And the question was, well, what would make you switch robot, and what does a robot need? Advanced visualization. I need to see the following. Doctors, if I could see this every time I do a case, this would be real. AI, computer vision, all the things you said, because good, strong sensors and strong data lead to strong compute. I get all that, but it was, and then Vip made the comment, he goes, so our first panel was on robotics, and we really didn't talk too much about a robot, and we talked about all the things the robots need to do that they're not doing. And it was, I think we're at that point because, you know, big players out there, and they've done an amazing job, and I know they have all this stuff ready to go when they need it. You know, I'm pretty sure, because that's what a big company does. But everyone else now is going to have to prove clinical. Only one company doesn't have to really prove clinical outcomes, and that was the company that's out there. And that seemed to be something that resonates. It seemed when I talk to investors and communicate is, what's the outcome difference of using everyone else's robot versus this big one that's in there? Is modularity going to be enough to change a robot or this? Or no, it's data and what they can see. Will this robot, you know, Vip said to me, Vip happens to be, you know, one of our advisors. And he said to me, Todd, when a robot can see something that a human can't see, I'm in. And that's why I want to work with you, but this isn't about me. To me, he said that 3 years ago to us. Right now, I still tell the robot what to do, and then it can do these magic things. So robots are great. I really am. I'm a big believer in it. It makes people better, and I absolutely agree with everybody. But when the robot still is directed by a surgeon, when a robot can give information to a surgeon that a surgeon doesn't have, that's when the game changes, and that's where we're not.
Fernando, I saw you shaking your head when we said, what does the next robot have to look like outside of an intuitive? And modularity, and you were like this, right? So that I want to explore that with the whole panel. And then maybe you can answer this for me. How come J&J and Medtronic have failed miserably in getting a robot to market? As an investor, how do you look at that? So is modularity important? Is low profile important? Is mobility important? Is the form factor of being overhead or bedside important as an investor when you look at it? And obviously you're biased with virtual incision.
We have a thesis, right? Let's see if it proves out or not.
Yeah.
But I think on the modularity side, and it ties into what you were saying, Todd, right? Why are people asking for advanced visualization and so on? Because the robot that they have from a mechanical perspective is fine. Mm-hmm. Right? That just shows you how everyone else is playing catch up, right? It shows you how that's the standard of care in robotics. It's Da Vinci, right? And I don't believe that just, you know, making, instead of putting one, you know, of the 4 arms or whatnot attached to one boom, putting them each on a different set of rollers is enough of a difference, right? Da Vinci is an incredible system, and I think is going to be here to stay. I think to cause a dent, you have to go where Da Vinci can't go, and you have to be really, really different, right? I mean, you ran us through with Moon as well. That's very, very different from anything that's being done today, right? Virtual incision, very, very different from anything that's being done today. And I think unless you're going in that direction, it's probably not worth it, right? At least from our investor dollars per se, right? Because you're not opening up necessarily sites of care. You're not opening up necessarily procedures, both from a size perspective or from an economics perspective, right? You really have to burst those doors open, and I think that requires something very, very different.
Jeff, your opinion, and I do want to get back to the Medtronic J&J because everybody wants to know, including the FDA. So Intuitive spent $750 million last year in R&D alone, yet they still own only 5% of a market they've had a monopoly on for 20 years. What are your perspectives on why that's occurring? Why can you only get 5% of a market?
So I think a lot of it has to do with how that market has changed over time. You know, when the initial Da Vinci platform was launched in the early 2000s, there was about 7 million ambulatory surgery procedures going on. Today, there's well over 20 million every year. Things like cholecystectomies, hernia repairs. These are extremely high volume procedures that, Intuitive has not been able to get much penetration into. And the reason is the locations that these procedures are being performed, they thrive on efficiency. They are surgical factories. Patients come in, they're prepped, they go through the procedure, they are discharged within a few hours later. And to get more adoption in those, you need a system that fits that environment. And it takes a lot for you to take a large platform like Da Vinci or CMR or Hugo and get it to work in that environment. So I think that's been one of the biggest challenges for adoption.
Joe, may I?
Yes, please.
Just one thing on the percentage of the market. When you look at a hospital, from the governance of a hospital, it's cardiothoracic, it's neurosurgery, it's orthopedics, it's OB, not GYN, OB. And now, because of COVID, it was family medicine. Those are the top 5 money makers in a hospital. None of those are on the robot. I mean, this particular robot. So if those doctors aren't screaming, when those doctors scream for a technology, they're going to get it. And that's now Intuitive built an unbelievable market cap on the backs of urologists because they found a real good niche, and it's made a difference, a huge difference. But again, urology, GYN, with no disrespect to the doctors that do those procedures, colorectal, general surgeons, they don't get to just say, I want this, and it comes in. The others do.
But that's in the large tier 1, tier 2, tier 1 hospitals that have the money to drop $1.5 million and then another $2 million a year in costs. Because it's always a crack up is you walk outside these hospitals where you donate $5 for the robot, and that's like owning a boat or a plane. It's not the purchase price of the robot or the plane or the boat that kills you. It's the ongoing maintenance that'll crush you.
Yeah.
Right? And so as we look at these platforms, when does the economics make sense to these hospital administrators? And to Jeff's point, and Edvardas, I'd like your thought on this, and also Fernando, these changing centers of care, how as a venture capitalist do you look at them, and how as a startup CEO in endovascular do you look at these? Are you looking in hospitals, or are you looking at these changing centers of care?
So there are basically 2 points. What we're trying to do is not to change clinical workflow that is accepted and that works, because if you disrupt the entire process, how it's done, then you really have to work hard to fit technology in. And that's completely to Todd's and Jeffrey's point, that you do not, if you do things very much differently, then you have a hard time proving that this new way is better and different. So if you fit with an existing flow and with this existing setting and with that particular hospital, and you bring value, so then it's a kind of different story. But you're totally right that probably the large academic hospitals have scientific budgets, they have clinical trials going on, they have KOLs who can spend that and that amount of money, and if they want a robot, they'll get a robot. But when does it start to be a standard of care? When you kind of create a system, well, not system, but the market that if you don't have a robot, you kind of have less value. Your hospital is not that good enough. And basically are forced to get a robot, otherwise you'll lose the competition. And that what happened with Da Vinci. I'm from Lithuania, it's a small country, we don't have huge amounts of patients, and still hospitals want to buy Da Vinci, even though they cannot afford it, but they kind of screw up the money because they want to be the hospital with the robotic system installed. Otherwise you are not keeping pace with others. And I think that fear of missing out is a very important factor, especially in Da Vinci's case.
Yeah, venture capitalists work on FOMO all the time. So what's your opinion?
That's probably true, by the way, on VC, because there is no right answer. No, I mean, for example, inguinal hernia, right? there's a lot of inguinal hernias that are staying in the hospital because the docs want to do them on a robot, right? That shouldn't be happening, right? And so, it's a trend which goes beyond robotics around shifting sites of service, going, downstream away from expensive hospital settings. And robotics is kind of holding it back a little bit, right? And I think it could accelerate it. I think there's an opportunity. There's a clear opportunity there, right? Let's see where it all plans out, of course, right? But going back to your comment on, Medtronic and J&J and so on and so forth.
That was my next
right?
question, so
Yeah.
you can start it.
Yeah. It's really, really hard, right? You talk about this, right? The V&V part is more complex, I believe, than anything else in medtech, right? I mean, you've done this a number of times, right? It's probably the hardest verification validation thing you can imagine in medtech, right? By probably a couple of order of magnitude.
Has the FDA moved the goalposts too, since Intuitive got their robot?
Yes. Yes. And those trials are hard to do. They're hard to design. The centers aren't really set up for them, right? I mean, there is an industry in cardiovascular device clinical trials, right? The centers themselves, the academic centers are set up for them. They have the research coordinators, et cetera, et cetera. We're running a trial right now with virtual incision, and the centers aren't ready for that, right? They're not set up. They don't have the research coordinator staff. You got to create that kind of momentum in these centers. And I believe there's only a handful of IDEs happening right now for robots, right? We're not talking 15 or 20. There's probably 4 or 5 maybe, right? And there's been 1 approved so far.
So your thesis is saying that money's not the problem. Because if money was the problem, J&J and Medtronic would have a robot on the market.
I mean, they're also trying to develop robots that are very complex, right? That are, capable of doing many, many different things at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, Jeff, you sold Auris to J&J and Verb to J&J and Titan out of Medtronic. So, and none of them are commercial. So what's the challenge?
So I think the first thing is these are extremely cash-rich companies, right? And all of them have had the experience now where they say, okay, wow, this is not a handheld medical instrument. We can't think of it like that anymore. Because as you guys said, as you go along and you get further in your design process, things get really ingrained and the cost of change becomes so much higher. It's almost exponential. And so it's really important that you're fleshing out things and designing things for simplicity and ease of use very early on. Because once you have locked-in designs and then try to address that stuff, it's too late. And that's today why we have systems coming on the market that have such incredible training requirements and learning curves. I mean, when you go to the conferences and hear about these other companies, like that's all they are talking about are these training tools and how they're going to help your teams be successful with these systems. How they're always going to have a rep in the room to guide you. The cost of serving that customer to success for these companies is substantial, and that just gets passed along to the hospital.
Todd, so running 2 major corporations, big strategics, how do you think Mahogany Rose thinking about this? And let me just put a tail on the end of this. There's only really 2 digital natives right now in soft tissue robotics, meaning that their core competency started at the digital starting line, right? Intuitive and CMR. And you could say Transenterics/Ascensus as well, in fairness. How does that culture, that is an analog organization that is playing defense and managing stock price, navigate bringing a digital platform culturally and economically to the market and still keep shareholders happy?
Yeah, it's a very good question. The shareholders are way more important at J&J and Medtronic than any other medical companies. And so just think about the cost of a robot, a successful selling robot. the gross margin and the profit margins of both those companies who have made boatloads of money on widgets, you start decreasing your overall gross margin. Shareholders don't give a crap that you have robots. They care about, we have earnings reports every single quarter, and we have more shareholders, well, J&J have more shareholders than anybody. Medtronic's the #1 medical company in the world. So not only do they have to develop a robot, they have to figure out how to develop a cost-effective robot, because their profit margins, because the way that everyone says they're going to be successful is they can afford to just give the robot away and do upcharges and product placement of their other stuff. Their shareholders are not going to sit down really smiling. So part of me, if I was being the cynic, I'm not sure they're in as much of a rush as everyone thinks until they really nail something. I think they have to keep it going until the other one puts it out. That's totally cynical, and nobody has told me that. That's my dumb opinion.
I like that.
But, well, thank you. So it's our opinion now. So, but the point is, to be honest with you, that the patient care, J&J and Medtronic know about patient care. But the shareholders, and unfortunately, the jobs of those CEOs, and Jeff's job is very different than even Gary's job, because Gary started this way and he was able to develop it from scratch, and you could take those chances. So other than Kevin bringing in Mako, no one's been able to buy one and make it work.
And that was an orthopedic robot.
And that was an
Which
orthopedic
is a
robot.
totally different challenge, format,
Right.
FDA pathway,
Yep.
and success.
Right.
Yeah, right.
And so just one person's opinion.
Yeah. Let's stay on the subject of the line that I think Scott Hunnekens coined it with Verb back in the day, is the democratization of surgery with Verb Surgical. And do robots really democratize healthcare in the near term? Seeing as the only people who can afford those are the big tier 1 hospitals in the major, most of the time metro cities, have oodles of cash. And then I'm challenging all of us on this. And then the disparity and breakaway from the rural hospitals and the lower income and the underrepresented people who don't get those, don't benefit for those. Now, romantically, we would say, yeah, we'll meet them around the bend when the economics come back in play. So who wants to take that one?
I'll jump into that.
All right.
When I think about what it takes to be successful in soft tissue surgery, I think it starts with 3 things. One is understanding. So the doctor's understanding of the patient, the anatomy, pathology, and technique. Visualization, being able to visualize the tools in the operative space and out of the operative space as well. What is going on, the situational awareness of, hey, this is what is going on around the patient and the operating room. The third is tools. Having access to the tools that sufficiently translate their intent to the tissue, what they want to achieve in the procedure. And the last, I think, is workflow. So having an efficient workflow in the operating room and team that can support that. And so when we talk about democratization, you need to make sure that you address all of those, right? And the moment that you don't, you're leaving people behind. And that's when we look at, can robotics do that? Yes, I think they could, but it's got to be, it's got to address all these 4 points. It's got to be, cost effective. It's got to help people understand that anatomy, whether it's like hyperspectral imaging or AI guidance, and it's got to be effective tools, and it's got to fit into the environments that we're doing those procedures.
So Fernando, as somebody who's early into a category on the illuminal robotics side versus soft tissue or robotics, what are you thinking about as Jeffery mentions all those items? Sure, you've got a robot. Sure, you'll make it through V&V. Again, title of this panel is Now What? So I don't think you can be less than $1 billion player and be in robotics these days based on that thesis.
Well, if you're referring to me, you mentioned Fernando previously, but
I'm sorry, yes.
yeah. So
It's his
I
hair
think
too.
that
I noticed his hair.
that it's still a step-by-step approach. So democratization of the procedure that can kind of lower the bar, for example, for a surgeon to do a procedure with like not being 1 out of million, but being 1 out of 5,000 expert who can use the robot and do procedure as good every time as anyone else, then that expands access to quality care. And as a next step, if you would see this evolving to telesurgery, when those centers, those rich centers you mentioned, can serve a region and can kind of be more accessible for patients in those rural areas. Yes, maybe that rural hospital would not buy like a bunch of different robots, but if in particular cases they can be served from a center, then from patient's perspective, the access to care is increased, even though if the center of the region spends that money. So probably it is also good to turn around that question, is that democratization kind of going the direction that not everyone can afford robot and therefore best care, but what if no democratization happens? How then the access of care for patients would be there? Would it be better or would it be worse?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think depending on how wide the aperture is, right? I mean, it has democratized prostatectomy, right? The standard of care of prostatectomy is now minimally invasive surgery in the U.S., right? As an example. But that's 150,000 procedures, right? So there's a lot left to be done. I think one of the requirements is just going to be these can't cost $1 million. That we have to move away from that, right? They have to start costing the price of cars, not the price of several houses. And that's going to take a while. But I think that's kind of a fundamental thing, both in terms of the upfront cost for facilities to get access to it, right? These are cash expenses. They got to somehow run that NPV on them, right? If you start at $2 million on your DCF, that's very different than if you start at 50,000 or 100,000 or whatnot. So I think that's part of it too, right? And then it enables different sites of care and so on and so forth. But there's a lot of we're like here. There's so.
But I want to challenge. We'll get the cost down, right? So I was at SDTS in Houston, Eric Wilson's show.
Yep.
And there was a stat that was put out in the audience that medical devices have gone the way of Moore's law, the inverse. And those of us who've been in med tech for 30 plus years, the cost of these have not gone down. And the thesis on, well, you can manufacture a robot at scale. No, you can't, just because of the way it's developed. And the cost of parts are going to come down. No, you can't. In fact, the cost of surgical devices has gone up dramatically, algorithmically over years. So I'm not sure I'm following that thesis.
I'm not talking about 5% year-on-year decreases.
No.
I'm talking about in one go completely different form factors. I think the form factors need to change completely.
Fine. Okay.
That's what I mean. I'm talking about 80% lower.
So not the form factors we're talking about today. Jeff, you got something to say?
I'm just saying, these platforms, the cost of ownership of a Da Vinci is almost $8 million over 7 years, between instruments and service contracts, maintenance, and just buying it. So like the $2.5 million that we're talking about, that's the startup cost, right? And then when you look at utilization of these things, last year they did 1.2 million procedures. They have 6,000 systems. That's one procedure every other day. That's not a lot of utilization. And so we need to think about how do we get more utilization of systems while also reducing the cost. And to do that, it has to be a form factor change. You cannot go out with large platforms and expect to do the 700,000 cholecystectomies out there or the 1.2 million hernia repairs. It's a radical change that's needed.
Got it. Okay, we're 4 minutes left in this panel, and we've got a bunch of emerging tech startup innovators, investors here. We just came through an accelerant in certain parts of medtech, and a lot of it in digital in the last 2 or 3 years because of COVID. It did become an accelerant. And now that we're on whatever it is the other side of that, is people are going, okay, hold on a second. We're watching costs go up dramatically in hospitals on labor costs. We're watching CapEx be evaluated tremendously. We're watching the sales cycle change tremendously in the medtech industry. People who are in their A, B, and C round, who just maybe got in 10, 15, 20 million, or 80 million. Over the next 2 or 3 years in digital, does medtech really understand digital, or is it a word they're tossing around irresponsibly right now? And all these medtech companies that have come out, especially in telehealth, especially in robotics, 200 under R&D right now. As a CEO, and we've got 3 sitting on here, and you sit as chair, I believe, in one of those organizations. As a CEO, the next 2 years is going to be a knife fight for financing and adoption utilization, because analog healthcare is still deciding how to bring in all these technologies. What do you as a CEO think, and what's your guidance? Because we've got 2 super tenured CEOs on here. What would you tell audience members right now? And do you worry about what it looks like to the outside world when you start to conserve cash because you want to stay in the fight? Right? We worry about those optics. And then is the sales process we thought about 3 years ago still hold true in the current market? So Todd, I'll start with you on that.
Thanks. You know, when you sit down and you think about the market now, it's first of all, it's a lot of these digital technologies have a solution looking for a problem. And that's not even a little bit of a business plan. There has to be the true unmet needs and problems out there that technology can solve and make a difference. And not just because it's going to make my operating room more efficient. We've been saying that for 100 years. And if I can save you 5 minutes per procedure, you can do another procedure every day. And every OR supervisor just, yeah, thanks to everyone. The last guy just told me the same thing. And I get there's math involved and I get all that, but no one really cares. At the end of the day, it still has to be outcomes. And the only thing, if AI, what does that mean? Right now, we're still computer vision and sensing is not necessarily AI. You know, we almost talk inside, there's little t and there's big T. Big T is going to be really hard to get true AI through the FDA, first of all, and proven and clinical. What's the confidence interval that someone's going to have to believe? If you say, well, 97% we're confident. So you're telling me I should take a 3% chance and say that's not cancer? You know what I mean? So what is, before you start trusting those things, it's not that easy. But I do think when you're talking to in our investors and groups, yeah, the thought process, even coming out now, we've run evaluations in hospitals very successfully. Doctors are screaming, they like it. What's the process it's going through? It's, they're working on 2019 budgets, a lot of the hospitals. Their value analysis committees are changing thoughts of how they bring in new technology. It's not the same game, but it's not up to them to change, to adapt to, well, it's new, you got to look at, it's up to the companies to adapt and make sure we have a plan. So the number one thing, I'm not smart enough to go difficult, but I really do think, do you have is there a problem that the hospital has, whether it's monetary, whether it's clinical, whether it's get patients out the door faster, because readmission rates are the number one thing that hospital administrators look at. That's the number one thing they're looking at, and they're only looking at it in 6 procedures, but it counts to everybody, and they lose reimbursement. Okay. End of the day, do I have a solution to a problem that we have, and this makes a difference? If you have that, I don't care if it's data, digital, or what have you. So sorry for the long answer.
No, it's a good answer, and thank you. So last response to it, Jeff, I'm going to give it to you. What do you tell the CEOs out here right now that are going to be cash crunched? It's going to be tight the next 2 years. They have a digital solution, and the solution's great, but is the market ready for it?
Great question. So one, capital conservation is important. So do not be afraid of that. Make sure that you're looking at ways of extending your runway while still creating the appropriate value with your technology. The second is understand the value, not just to the surgeon, but every stakeholder in that value assessment committee, because there's a number of people that will throw up a flag and block the adoption of your technology that you might not have considered. And so make sure you do that analysis.
Got it. All right, gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. Let's hear it for the